Paul Krugman is here. He is professor of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His new book is called The Return of Depression Economics. I am pleased to have him on the program. His voice is frequently one that is listened to in the councils of government and elsewhere as people consider what is happening in the global economics of this planet. Welcome to the broadcast.
Great to be here.
Tell me, we were talking earlier about Japan, and I have watched as Robert Rubin, right before he left as Secretary of the Treasury. I've listened to George Soros and others who have huge investments or have had around the world say that the Asian economic crisis is over. We have seen the worst. I realize that in Japan, they're still going through a very, very difficult time. So
and in China.
And in China.
So the two biggest Asian countries are still in deep sushi. No, I mean,
deep sushi.
I think the right way to think about this is to say that we were flying along in this airplane that everyone told us was completely safe. And suddenly, in a clear blue sky, the airplane went into this terrifying, uncontrolled dive. And through some combination of good luck and good piloting, we leveled off and we seemed to be climbing again. Now, one reaction is to say, see, everything was under control all along. But I think the reaction ought to be, my God, maybe we don't know how this thing works. And maybe we've just dodged a bullet, to mix metaphors. But it's not so much that this was the worst crisis we've ever had, but it was the most inexplicable crisis we've ever had. It tells us that the world is a much more dangerous place than we thought it was just 2 years ago.
It's more dangerous because?
Because the kinds of safeguards that we built up after the Great Depression, we know what the Great Depression was like. We know about bank runs, and we thought we had all of those things under control. And now what we had in these last couple of years is a sort of high-tech, globalized version of the kinds of things that happened in the 1930s. Now, the world didn't end this year so far. Probably we're going to have a few months of relatively good news. But it's showing us that the world has outgrown the protections we built. We built a Maginot Line of defenses, and it looks like it's being outflanked.
When you look at Japan, I want to go back to Japan.
Yeah.
What is it you see there now happening when you have zero interest rates?
Right. Japan is, I'd say Japan is the heart of what I think of as the reappearance of old troubles in a new sort of higher tech guise. Japan is an economy which suffers from an excess of virtue. The problem with the Japanese is they want to save so much that they can't persuade investors to invest all of it, even at a zero interest rate.
Right.
And that's incredible.
Because saving is so deep in their psyche.
Well, it's partly that. It's also one thing. Some good things have happened. They've eliminated inflation. They've convinced people there will be no more inflation. That turns out to be disastrous. Because when you don't expect inflation, cash looks like a very good investment. Mm-hmm. And the Japanese are busily accumulating cash, which means that there isn't enough spending.
It used to be said at the time of the Japanese economic crisis, when the Japanese were seemingly at the lowest ebb, it said that they had to change their entire banking system. That was number one.
Yeah.
Because the banking system, in a sense, they were loaning too much money to everybody, and therefore they're making a lot of bad loans, and they need to regulate their banking system. And if they did that, with other suggestions from American and other places, then they would get on the road to reform. They also, it was said at the time, had to change their philosophy of investing versus saving. America had the different problem, everybody used to say. We had too much investing and not enough saving, and that was what was wrong with the American economy. My question is, did they change the banking system, number one, and B, did it have no effect?
They did. They've done a lot of things which are probably good in the long run. And as John Maynard Keynes, my hero, said, in the long run, we are all dead. The problem is none of these things was good for the short run. The banks are doing more responsible lending in Japan now. Right. That, unfortunately, is not what they need. They need people to spend money, not be careful about how it's spent. The other thing I think you have to say is that if there's one lesson that you learn when you look back either at the 1930s or you look at what happened these last couple of years, it's that bad things can happen to good economies. There's a lot about Japan that's still really good. The technology is still really good. The business leadership, in many ways, is still pretty good.
The management methods and the business plans
their
are all
ability
good.
to understand. You look at the latest bits of information technology from Japan, and they're actually still very much competitive with the world. What they've done is they've managed to have a financial screw-up. They had this enormous financial bubble in the late 1980s, which burst, catapulted them into this sort of trap they're now stuck in where zero interest rates are not low enough. To me, they don't look like some alien race that's inferior to us. To me, they look a lot like us. If you talk to the Japanese, they will say, America 1999 reminds us of Japan 1989. There's a little bit of element of wishful thinking in that, right? But
is enough of a veracity in that to worry you?
Yeah, sure. If you think that the U.S. market, if you think that the Dow is unreasonable, if you think that, say, 7,000 is a more reasonable value than 11,000, which is possible, you ask yourself, what would happen to the U.S. economy if, in the course of a couple of months, the market were to decide to agree with that assessment? We could very easily, 2 years from now, find ourselves in the same boat that Japan is in.
The market doesn't agree with that assessment, doesn't accept the Japanese wisdom that we are where they were in '89 when everything looked great and all of a sudden everything came tumbling down. The market, the stock market, doesn't accept that wisdom because, in your judgment?
Well, good question. One answer is there's been some real good news. Don't want to say that, America, it's not a facade. There's a lot of good stuff about the American economy. Nobody thought we could grow this much without inflation. But, of course, nobody thought the Japanese economy circa 1989 could do that. The other thing is, look, suppose that you were skeptical about whether the valuations were right. And you've probably been skeptical for 2 years. At this point, you've been sitting on your cash while everybody else has been making money. And in the long run, you'll be right. But in the long run, hey, particularly a lot of investment in this modern world is done not by the person whose own money is at stake, but by managers who are on average about 29 years old, don't remember a falling stock market, don't remember a recession.
Some of them don't remember '87.
Well, no, a lot of them don't. I mean, it's really true that they've never seen anything but a strong dollar and a strong Dow and a booming economy.
Okay, but that's not the reason that they don't recognize what I mean. Because if they look at it, they say, look, what they normally look at is an expectation of corporate earnings, right? No,
but in fact, if you really do it, if you really do the arithmetic here, it's very hard, even with the corporate earnings we've got, and even with projecting forward that things stay good, it's really, really hard to come up with a set of numbers that will justify those current valuations. You have to believe, basically, that everything that can possibly go right will go right. Inverted Murphy's Law. Now, could happen. The main point I would want to make is that we've seen other economies go through this incredible optimistic boom, and then that turns sour, and we've seen that some of the standard ways of dealing with it haven't worked in those cases, and we ought to be trying to prepare ourselves for that eventuality instead of saying we're great, we're on top of the world.
How do we prepare ourselves?
Well, the first thing is I'd like to see a little bit of inflation. I think that we ought to fight this price stability. That we're a lot better. We'd be a lot better off if we make sure that the inflation numbers look like 2.5%, so that the interest rates are a little bit higher when you go into the recession. What I've been saying to the Japanese is that they actually need to try to convince people that there's going to be some inflation in Japan to make it so that they don't hang on to their cash. A lot easier to convince people.
Inflation does what to an economy?
Oh, I mean, the good thing is inflation means that you have interest rates that are a bit higher. I mean, that sounds like a bad thing, but actually it means that you come into a recession with interest rates that are like 6% instead of interest rates that are like 2%. And then when the recession comes, you have 6% of interest to cut instead of 2%. So you're more likely to be able to stop the recession. It creates a little bit of, people, makes it a little bit harder to plan, but we're talking about 2-3% inflation. It doesn't really do a lot of harm. The other thing.
But if you make this argument that we need a little bit of inflation, you are, in a sense, going exactly against the grain of Alan Greenspan, whose entire tenure at the Federal Reserve has been to make sure that there was a restraint on inflation, and he's done it by the manipulation of interest rates.
Well,
correct or not?
Yeah.
So you're saying the guy that's given the most credit, along with Rubin and the president, because it happened on their watch, for what has been an expansive economy and a reduction of the budget deficit, has been, in your judgment, wrong?
No, I think he may have carried a little bit too far. There's a big difference between getting the economy from 10% inflation down to 3%, which is a very good thing, and
that's Paul Volcker.
and getting it, well, but Greenspan more or less kept, and getting it from 3 to 0, which is not such a good thing. And, there was a guy who back in '91 wrote an article saying, we should probably not squeeze all of the inflation out of the economy. We might need that. And I think his name was Larry Summers. He wrote an article about that back in '91. So it's not that outlandish an idea, but it's a something that tends to, very hard. I give Greenspan credit for not being...
Well, I wonder if Larry Summers, now Secretary of the Treasury, still believes that and still says that.
I'm sure he doesn't say it because he's learned that from Greenspan that whatever you say, make sure it isn't clear.
Yeah, and it causes tremors on Wall Street.
That's right. But I give us some credit. I give the Fed some credit for, in fact, not going into the temptation to drive the numbers on inflation all the way to 0.
The point here is what ought to be done. I mean, that's what I want to get at. And you're saying, a little more inflation. I just want to point out that a lot of people would differ with you on that point.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Including the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Well, it's not clear what he, in his inmost self, believes, but he wouldn't agree with me flat out, sure.
Okay, because you're saying, well, maybe he would like to see, wouldn't mind seeing a little bit, but he worries if you see a little bit, you get a lot more, and that therefore that's the danger.
Yeah. I mean, look, the Bank of England, who I happen to think is, they're also smart guys. Their inflation target is 2.5.
And our target is?
We don't have a formal target.
What do you think it is?
I think ours is a sort of 2.
Yeah.
But theirs is 2.5, not less than 2.5, but 2.5. If the inflation rate there drops to 1.5, they try to push it up.
Okay, a little bit of inflation would be good for us. What else would be good for us?
We got to at least say that we're willing in emergencies to step on the flow of international capital. What's happened now is that people have come to believe that no matter what's happening, you can always move your money, even if it's a panic situation.
So how do we accelerate the flow of international capital?
We don't accelerate it. We slowly break it.
Restrain it.
Yeah. I mean, it turns out if you look at the success stories in what's happened lately, which is South Korea has turned things around. Right. Brazil did a lot better than we thought it would. Right. In both cases, what was crucial was they did what everybody said, oh, you mustn't do, which was they got the bankers in a room and said, look, if you try to pull your money out, all hell's going to break loose. So I want an agreement not to pull the money out. Okay. Now, they managed to make it, voluntary in the sense of you, and you volunteer. But it was. Now the trouble is that the world is getting more complicated, and it's not just the banks. In these cases, if you got the banks in the room, that was enough. But you start to worry about the hedge funds and so on. We're going to have to at least make it clear that that can happen, which in itself is probably enough to sort of make the hot money a little cooler. That gives us some room.
What else would you do?
We got to think
inflation, restrain capital flow.
That's right. The third thing is we got to start and this is hard. We have to figure out who else in the economy is, for all practical purposes, a bank. And we have to extend the same kinds of controls, regulations, and also support that we have for banks.
Bank, what kind of bank do you mean? You mean like a commercial bank, like an investment bank, or either of those?
What I mean by a bank is anybody who basically takes promises to pay people short term, but invests in longer term stuff. And the reason that's important is when one of those gets in trouble, then the financial system freezes. For 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks last fall, when LTCM went down, the U.S. financial markets, the whole funding of real estate investment, just came to a dead halt. There was nothing happening, and it was because, although no one had really noticed it, all of that was dependent on things like LTCM to keep the wheels turning.
Now, who deserves credit for saving LTCM? What, was it the investment banks that had an investment in LTCM?
Well, no. I mean, they were. That was again. They volunteered to rescue it because they were told to volunteer.
By?
Most important, Bill McDonough at the New York Fed, who got them in a room and
said to them, "We can't let LTCM go down."
That's right. And
because it's already a freeze in terms of, say, the real estate.
Well, it had just starting to happen there, but yeah, at that point, people at the Fed. I was talking with one of them, and I was saying, "What do we do now?" And he said, "Pray." But what they actually did was they got LTCM's investors in a room and got them to cough up money, and they got and Alan Greenspan stood behind him, and Bob Rubin looked confident on the steps of the Treasury, and it was great. I mean, it was a fantastic thing. This was the army was about to break in rout, and the general rode up on his white horse and waved his sword around and shouted something, and he rallied them, and that's great. But a financial system that depends on heroes to save it is the one that someday is not going to find the hero.
A couple locker room kind of questions. Yeah. Number one, I have, notwithstanding this book, The Return of Depression Economics, and our analogy to Japan, right? Number two, the things you've just suggested in terms of what would make you feel better. How good do you feel about the American economy? And how good are the good times going to last?
I'm very nervous. We've got all the classic indicators of a bubble, right? We got all the, if you're looking for all the things that are true, have been true just about when things went pop in previous, everything from Japan '89 back to Britain in the early '80s, back to, you can go back through a whole sequence of them, and you'll find that actually there's a bank economist named Stephen King. It's a great name for this. Who's done a sort of checklist of how do you know you're in a bubble when, and we sort of fit 8 of the 10 criteria right now.
So we're on all the 10 criteria we match.
Yeah, well, 8 of 10.
Okay.
But it's there's a lot of good news, but the financial markets are better than the good news. It's sort of we weren't as bad as that.
In other words, notwithstanding the good news, we shouldn't be doing this well.
That's right.
All right, but here's the problem. It's cry wolf time. You and others have been saying this, and the economy continues to grow. We're at 4% annual growth rate, aren't we?
That's right.
Stock market is crashing through 1,100, right?
That's right. It's the trouble is
11,000.
Eventually, the wolf does come.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, if it's going to come in 2004, then I got
I don't
a lot of good times to invest in.
That's right. No, I could be wrong.
Well, you'll eventually be right, because eventually economies do go through cycles.
Yeah, but don't you have the feeling there's a kind of manic feeling right now? I mean,
it's not any different than I can remember 2 years ago walking down the street with people saying, "I'm getting all of my, except in my own company, I'm pulling all of my investments out of the stock market." I said, "Why?" Is it because it cannot last?
Yeah, I think the difference for me, and sure, I don't claim to be a market forecaster. And you task me, is the market crashing while we're here in this studio,
right, exactly.
or is it going to wait another 18 months?
Right.
But the difference for me is that if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I'd say, well, if it crashes, it's nothing Greenspan can't handle. We know how to deal with these things. Paper losses, the real economy will be fine.
Right.
What I now know from Japan, what I now know from Asia is that's not anything like a guarantee. And if we don't start to put some Scotch tape on these rips right away, it may be a lot worse than you think when the crash comes.
So what you're saying, the return of depression economics, and in addition what you're saying here, is that we ought to be looking very carefully at the experience of the Japanese?
That's right. The Japanese, the South Koreans, even the Indonesians, because they're not that different from us. They're more like us than not. And, Americans have this thing. Americans, we sometimes get afraid of the rest of the world. We don't learn from the rest of the world. When you try to talk to American businessmen about what happened in Britain or in Germany or even in Canada, they just don't think it has anything to do with them. As long as the guys aren't immediately competitors to us, then the rest of the world, we change the channel. The rest of the world really doesn't exist to us. But the Japanese in particular seem so different from us that we tend to sort of think of them either as invincible demons or as complete losers. The reality is that They're a lot like us, and if
A lot like us in the way their economy works and the way their...
Sure. Japan, my feeling about Japan is it's as if, Japan, it's like a civil, it's an advanced, sophisticated, well-educated, democratic, stable country. No, they've got their problems, and here they are stuck in something which is kind of like a slow-motion version of the 1930s. Now, that's as if a modern city was suddenly invaded by nomads from the steppes. That's not supposed to happen in the modern world. And it seems to me that ought to shake us up quite a lot. We shouldn't say, oh, well, it's just the Japanese. We should say, gee, how much do we have in common with them? And the more you look at it, the more you start to realize that except for immigration, which is a really big thing we have in our favor, we have a lot in common with them. We could... if we're not careful, find ourselves in something like the same kind of trap they're now in.
If there should be a great debate about our economic future in the year 2000 political campaign, what ought it be?
It ought to be about, it really ought to be about what have we done to make this economy safer. I'm afraid it's going to be how are we going to use this surplus to hand out goodies to the population? That's what it's probably going to be about.
And it's going to be Medicare, it's going to be prescription medicine, it's going to be whatever.
Yeah, and what it really should be is about who is more equipped to postmodernize our institutions so that we don't turn into another Japan. I have very little hope that that's the way it's going to turn out, but that's what ought to be on the agenda.
Is there any part of you that thinks all of the effort to reduce the budget deficit was a bad idea?
No, because I think that's another thing that we probably have going for us is the ability, because we start from a surplus, it means that we can do an FDR if we need to.
John Maynard Keynes.
Yeah.
You're what? How would you describe his ideas for you?
Oh, I think it's, he is the great economist of the 20th century because he not only showed us how to understand depressions, but showed us a way out.
The way he showed us out was to spend his way out, wasn't it?
It was more sophisticated than that. It was first print money and then spend in emergencies. But it's a little bit better than that. And
what was it then?
Well, it was first that you push money into circulation,
right,
and secondly that you do pump prime the economy with spending,
right.
And the point is, it worked. It
put people to work, and it gives people. And you encourage them to buy things, and therefore people make more things, and therefore they buy more things.
That's right.
Is that it?
Well, you have to remember just how hard it was. Lots of ideas. Theory of evolution sounds pretty simple once it's been explained.
I understand. But that's exactly what you're saying the Japanese need to do. The
Japanese need to do it on a way. Yeah, there's more to it again than that. But yes, that's what they need to do. And they have. What can I say? The big problem I think we've had is that in the 70s and the 80s, we had the problem of governments doing that sort of thing too much. And so we learned the hard lesson that you can't always be printing money. That inflation doesn't solve all your problems. Now we're fighting the last war. We're sitting there and saying, well, that means that printing money is always a bad idea. That means that austerity is the answer to all problems. Pain is good for you. And the trouble is that times have changed, and now deflation is a bigger threat than inflation. If we continue to fight the last war, then we make ourselves a lot more vulnerable to depression economics.
The return of depression economics. Paul Krugman, professor of economics at MIT. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.